unique skills that Vice Admiral Blandy had that allowed him to lead this charge?
Blandy is a fascinating individual. He graduated first in his class from the Naval Academy in 1913. In the 1920s, he was probably the Navy's foremost naval gunnery expert. Absolute wizard with naval gunnery, particularly large caliber ordnance aboard battleships. From 1941 to 43, he was chief of the Bureau of Ordnance here in Washington, and was incredibly talented from an administrative standpoint, from understanding naval bureaucracy, working with industry, civilian researchers, understanding both the science and the technology behind naval weaponry at the time. And in particular, Blandy was particularly good at working with media relations, and had interacted with the Army and with the Army Air Forces. So Blandy had almost all the key elements you needed for such a publicly visible role as commander of what became known as the Army-Navy Joint Task Force 1.
So Blandy is now in charge. Some big decisions to be made. I mean, if I'm in his shoes, the first decision is, what are we going to put into the lagoon? And he made some amazing decisions around the mix of nationalities of ships that he placed in that lagoon to test. What was the thinking behind that, and why was that?
Blandy was in an interesting position because they knew they needed a lot of target ships, representing almost every single class of naval vessel. In this case, Blandy and some wanted warships that were literally only a few years old in some instances, whereas others dated back to before World War I. So Blandy had this eclectic mix of old and new, but a lot of these ships were still serviceable. And in fact, it took practically an act of Congress for the ships to be declared scrap and obsolete for Blandy to use. Now, let's go back a few months. Going back to September and October of 45, the decision was made, the Army wanted to use about 10 Japanese warships that had miraculously survived the combat in the Pacific. In the end, there were actually only 3 foreign ships involved in crossroads. One was the Japanese battleship Nagato, which was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's flagship for the attack on Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941. The other was the cruiser Sakawa, which had been commissioned in 1944 and was essentially a new warship. And last was the German heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, which, with the battleship Bismarck in May of 1941, sank the pride of the Royal Navy, the battle cruiser HMS Hood.
That brings us on to, of course, the weaponry that was used in the test. We had just finished the war. Was the weaponry used that much different from what we'd seen in the war itself?
Not at all. We had, as you and I had been speaking earlier, we only had 7 nuclear weapons in July of 1946 when this test took place. The principle, now we had used 2 types of bombs during the war. The Hiroshima bomb, known as Little Boy, was what we call a gun-type weapon, where you have 2 masses of uranium-235 that are brought together via a gun barrel to form a critical mass of fissionable material. It's a very unstable design, and being able to produce enough uranium-235 is extraordinarily difficult. The other design, which was actually the Trinity test, and later the bomb dropped in Nagasaki, was more viable from a production standpoint. This was known as the Fat Man bomb, later named the Mark III. And it was a plutonium implosion bomb with a core of about 13.6 pounds of plutonium that you would then compress via implosion to set off the nuclear reaction. Now, the problem with the Mark III is that it was very difficult to assemble. Once assembled, it was only good for about 48 hours due to the batteries for the timers to set off the implosion device. There was an extremely small number of people qualified to actually assemble the bomb to begin with. It was very unwieldy. They didn't call it Fat Man for nothing, so it was very difficult to actually put aboard an aircraft, of which you only had a handful of special B-29 bombers, codenamed Silver Plate, that had been modified to accommodate it with the size of the bomb within the bomb bay of the bomb doors. And so it just wasn't a good bomb. Not to mention, aerodynamically, it was horrible. It was equivalent to dropping a Ford Pinto out of the air and slapping wings on it, hoping to give it aerodynamic characteristics. It was a terrible design. So, get to the point, by late 45, early 46, engineers at Los Alamos began developing what was called the Mark IV, where they tried to re-engineer the aerodynamics of Fat Man to make it a more accurate weapon. General Groves, who's still overseeing this effort, did not want to potentially risk exposure of a new advanced atomic weapon design there at Crossroads. So instead, the decision was made, let's use some of the existing stockpile, the older Mark IIIs. Once they're expended, we'll begin to replace them with the newer Mark IVs. So, to make a long story short, the weapons used for Shot Able and Shot Baker at Crossroads were essentially Mark III bombs, in no way changed from the weapon dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th.